Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of ice and survival where humans and the largest land predators shared the same frozen world. We're diving into how the Inuit people survived encounters with polar bears across generations. Forget the romanticized tales of brave hunters you might have seen. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single winter living among these massive predators, and I'll explain why today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're hearing this from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to me seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a small Inuit settlement somewhere along the Arctic coast. The good news is you're alive. The bad news, the temperature outside is negative 40 degrees. Your bed is a raised platform covered in thick caribou hides that smell of smoke and seal oil because that's what preserves them. There's no central heating, no electric blanket. There is only the warmth from a stone lamp burning rendered seal blubber, the kulik, providing just enough heat to keep the inside of your dwelling at just above freezing, just enough to survive another night. It's still dark outside. It will be dark for many more hours, or perhaps many more days depending on the season. In the winter darkness, the polar bears come closer to the settlements. They are hungry, they are curious, they are the largest land predator on Earth, and they have no natural fear of humans. The dwelling you're in, it might be made of stone and whale bones and sod if you're in a permanent settlement, or perhaps it's an igloo, carefully constructed of precisely cut snow blocks. Or maybe it's a tent of seal skins stretched over driftwood or whale ribs if it's summer. The walls are thick, but not thick enough to stop a determined polar bear. The Inuit people have known this for thousands of years, have lived with this knowledge for thousands of years, have survived with this knowledge for thousands of years. You smell the seal oil burning, hear the soft breathing of family members nearby, feel the weight of fur clothing that you never fully remove even while sleeping. The Inuit learned long ago that being ready, always ready, was the first defense against the white bears who roamed the ice. The Nanook, as they call them, the wandering ones. Survival wasn't about avoiding bears, it was about understanding them. The Inuit didn't just survive in spite of polar bears, they survived because they learned to predict them, to respect them, to become like them in some ways. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted in this environment. The same skills that helped them hunt seals helped them avoid becoming prey themselves. Morning comes, though the sky might still be dark or merely a deep blue during the winter. The first thing any Inuit does before leaving their dwelling is to listen. They listen for the sound of heavy paws on snow, for the sound of breathing that isn't human, for the subtle creaks of ice that might signal something large moving nearby. This listening, this awareness, it saved lives for generations. It becomes as natural as breathing. Before stepping outside, they prepare their tools, not weapons, tools. A tool can feed your family. A tool can build your home. A tool can save your life. The same hunting spear that brings food can keep a curious bear at distance. The same knife that cuts seal, meat can create warnings to alert others of danger. Everything has multiple purposes when you live on the edge of survival. The men take their harpoons and spears when they leave, even if they're just checking fishing nets or visiting neighbors. The women carry igloos, the curved knives that can process a seal or caribou in minutes. Children are taught from the time they can walk to look around constantly, to notice changes in the snow, to spot the yellowish fur of a polar bear against the white landscape. These aren't just precautions. They are the rhythm of everyday life. Some settlements would keep dogs, not pets like we think of them today, but working animals that served as transportation, hunting partners, and the first warning system against approaching bears. A good dog team could smell a polar bear long before any human could see it, could hear its approach before even the most experienced hunter. The dogs would grow restless, would bark in a particular way that meant only one thing: Nanook is coming. But dogs weren't available to all Inuit communities, and sometimes the weather was too harsh for even the most alert person to see or hear an approaching bear. So they developed other methods, other ways to protect themselves and their families. Some would build their winter homes with narrow, low entrances that required a person to crawl to enter. A polar bear, standing up to 10 feet tall when on its hind legs, would have difficulty navigating such a small entrance quickly. Those precious extra seconds could mean survival. Others would create alarm systems from bones and antlers strung together that would rattle and sound when disturbed. These were placed around the perimeter of settlements, not to keep bears out. Nothing could truly keep a determined polar bear out, but to provide warning, to provide time to prepare. Time was the most valuable resource when a bear approached. The Inuit understood something most modern people don't. A polar bear is not just a predator. It is a patient, intelligent hunter capable of complex strategies. Bears would wait, motionless for hours, for a seal to emerge from a breathing hole in the ice. They would stalk prey by hiding their black nose, the only part of them not white, with their paw while approaching. This level of hunting intelligence meant that the Inuit had to be equally strategic in their own behavior. They developed routines, ways of moving through the landscape that minimized risk. Never travel alone if possible. Take different paths to check fishing or hunting spots so as not to create predictable patterns a bear might learn. Process meat and dispose of food scraps, far from sleeping areas. Hang food caches from poles or place them on elevated platforms that bears couldn't easily reach. These weren't superstitions or traditions for their own sake. They were survival tactics refined over generations. The clothing they wore, it wasn't just for warmth. The thick fur parkas, often made from caribou hide with the fur turned inward against the body for insulation, also provided some protection against initial contact with bear claws. The outer layer, sometimes made from seal skin, would be smoother, allowing snow to slide off rather than melt and soak through. This clothing was essential for surviving the environment, but it also served as a first line of defense if a bear did attack. Their mittens, thick and extending, up the forearm, allowed them to handle tools even in the deepest cold. Their boots, often made from sealskin with the fur still attached inside, kept feet warm even when standing on ice for hours. Every piece of clothing represented generations of knowledge about survival in the Arctic. Nothing was created for style or status. Everything served a purpose, often multiple purposes. The Inuit understood polar bear behavior in ways that science is only now beginning to document. They knew that a bear with a yellowish coat had been eating well, had been consuming seal, blubber that stained their fur. A whiter bear was likely hungrier, more desperate, more dangerous. They knew that a bear that approached directly without pausing or showing caution was more likely to attack than one that circled or watched from a distance. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed through stories, through observation, through the collective memory of people whose lives depended on understanding their environment. When a bear was spotted near a settlement, the response was organized and calm. There was no panic. Panic used precious energy and clouded judgment. Instead, the community would gather together. Strength in numbers was one of the few advantages humans had over the much stronger bears. Men would prepare their hunting tools. Women would secure children inside dwellings. Everyone had a role. The goal wasn't to kill the bear unless absolutely necessary. The goal was to encourage it to move on, to find easier food sources elsewhere. They would make noise, bang tools against each other or against pieces of wood or bone. They would stand together, appearing larger as a group. Sometimes they would throw small objects near the bear, not to hit it, but to startle it, to make it reassess whether approaching humans was worth the risk. Bears are naturally cautious despite their size and strength. They prefer to avoid injury if possible. A bear with a broken paw or damaged tooth might starve. The Inuit understood this calculation in the bear's mind and used it to their advantage. If deterrence failed, if a bear continued to approach despite warnings, only then would they consider killing it. And even then, the taking of a bear's life was not done casually or without reverence. The Inuit, like many indigenous peoples, viewed themselves as part of the natural world, not separate from it or above it. A bear that gave its life, whether hunted for food or killed in self-defense, deserved respect. Nothing would be wasted. The meat would feed families. The fat would provide fuel for lamps that offered heat and light during the long, dark winters. The fur would become bedding or clothing that helped humans survive the very cold that bears were naturally adapted for. The claws might become amulets or tools. The teeth could become needles or awls for working hide. Even the tendons could become sinew for binding tools or sewing clothing. In this way, even in death, the bear continued to be part of the cycle of survival in the Arctic. But killing bears was always the last resort, not the first. Unlike settlers who would come later with their guns and traps, viewing bears as trophies or competitors, the Inuit recognized themselves as just one species trying to survive in a harsh environment. They had lived alongside bears for thousands of years, had developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dominance. This relationship extended to the spiritual world as well. Many Inuit believed that bears had souls, had awareness similar to humans. Some stories told of bears that could understand human speech, or of humans who could transform into bears and back again. These weren't just entertaining tales told. During long winter nights, they reinforced the idea that the line between human and animal was perhaps thinner than we modern people might believe, that there was a kinship that deserved acknowledgement. Shamans might wear bear claws during ceremonies, not to show dominance over the bear, but to channel its strength and wisdom. Children might be given small carvings of bears, not as toys, but as reminders of the respect they should have for these powerful creatures they shared the land with. The bears were not monsters in these stories. They were neighbors, sometimes dangerous neighbors, but part of the same world. The Inuit had names for individual bears they encountered repeatedly, particularly those that frequented certain hunting grounds or showed distinctive behaviors. This wasn't anthropomorphizing. It was recognizing that bears, like humans, were individuals with their own patterns and personalities. A bear that was especially cautious around humans might be treated differently than one that showed unusual boldness. This detailed knowledge, this recognition of individual animal behavior, it saved lives. If you were an Inuit child, you would learn about polar bears before you could fully talk. You would learn to recognize their tracks in the snow, to differentiate between the larger prints of males and the slightly smaller ones of females. You would learn that a mother with cubs was to be given extra space and respect, that she was the most dangerous bear you might encounter because she was protecting something more precious than her own life. You would learn to recognize the signs of a bear's recent presence even if you couldn't see the animal itself. Fresh tracks, of course, but also disturbed snow around seal-breathing holes, broken ice where a bear might have tested its weight, even the particular way that birds might circle or cry that could indicate a large predator below. These observations, this awareness, it wasn't taught in lessons. It was learned through living, through daily experience and the gentle corrections of elders when you missed something important. The tools used for protection against bears were the same tools used for hunting and daily life. The harpoon that could take a seal could keep a bear at bay if needed. The bow and arrow that brought down caribou could stop a charging bear if the shot was placed perfectly. But these weapons required skill to use effectively against such a powerful animal, and carrying them through deep snow or while performing other tasks wasn't always practical. So the Inuit developed other tools specifically for bear encounters. One was the bear spear, similar to the ones used by other cultures for hunting boar or other dangerous game. These spears had crosspieces near the blade that prevented a struck animal from continuing up the shaft to reach the hunter. The blade itself would be made of whatever materials were available, sometimes stone in earlier periods, later metal obtained through trade. The shaft would be made of driftwood, precious in the treeless Arctic, or from the tusks of walrus or narwhal if available. But even these purpose-made weapons were last resorts. The best protection was awareness, communication, community. Settlements would sometimes post lookouts during dangerous seasons. Often, younger people with sharp eyes who could spot the yellow-white shape of a bear against the snow and ice from great distances. They would call out warnings, would alert the community with specific calls that everyone recognized instantly. This collective vigilance, this shared responsibility for safety, it defined Inuit communities. If a hunter was going out alone, which sometimes couldn't be avoided, even though traveling in pairs or groups was preferred, they might carry specific tools just for bear protection. Something as simple as a pouch of seal oil might be used to distract a bear if an encounter seemed imminent. The oil would be thrown away from the person. The strong scent attracting the bear's attention and powerful hunger drive long enough for the hunter to retreat or prepare a more effective defense. Some hunters carried specially prepared bags filled with feathers or other light materials. If confronted by a bear, they would throw these into the wind, creating a confusing cloud that might startle the bear or obscure the hunter's exact position momentarily. These weren't foolproof methods. Nothing was foolproof when dealing with one of nature's most perfect predators, but they could provide precious seconds needed to ready a weapon or reach safety. Inuit knowledge about bear behavior became increasingly sophisticated over thousands of years of coexistence. They observed that bears would often investigate strange objects or smells by initially circling them, approaching and retreating several times before coming close. This cautious behavior could be used to a human's advantage, allowing time to prepare or to judge the bear's intentions. Not all bears that approached humans intended to attack. Some were merely curious or looking for easy food scraps rather than seeing humans themselves as prey. They knew that polar bears, unlike some other bears, are almost purely carnivorous, that they need the fat from marine mammals to survive. A particularly lean season for seals meant more dangerous bears that might take risks they would normally avoid. The Inuit would watch for signs of seal abundance or scarcity, would know that years when ringed seals produced fewer pups were years when bear encounters might be more frequent and more dangerous. The dwellings themselves evolved with bear protection in mind. In some regions, Inuit would build their homes, partially underground, using the earth itself as insulation against both the cold and potential bear intrusions. The entrances would be long, low tunnels that bears would have difficulty navigating. Some tunnels had multiple turns, not just to keep cold winds from blowing directly inside, but to create a space that would be awkward for a large bear to move through. Inside these homes, whether semi-subterranean dwellings or igloos constructed for winter hunting trips, essential tools would always be kept within reach. The quillik, the stone lamp burning seal oil, could become a weapon if needed, the hot oil capable of deterring even the most determined bear if thrown accurately. Spears would be stored near sleeping platforms, not just for convenience but to provide immediate access in case of midnight visitors. The landscape itself was used for protection when possible. Settlements were often built near cliffs or large rock formations that provided at least one direction that bears were less likely to approach from. Natural features like narrow passes between rocks might be enhanced with carefully placed stones to create bottlenecks where bears could be more easily spotted or deterred. Nothing in the environment was neutral. Everything was either helpful for survival or a potential challenge to be managed. Communication between settlements was essential for safety, especially during seasons when bears were most active or hungry. Messengers might travel between communities, carrying news of unusually aggressive bears in the region or updates on where seals were plentiful, which meant bears would likely be focused there rather than near human habitations. This network of information, this shared knowledge, it created a larger awareness that extended beyond what any individual or single settlement could maintain. The changing seasons brought different challenges in bear relations. During winter, when sea ice was extensive, bears could range widely hunting for seals. They might only occasionally come near Inuit settlements, but during late summer and early fall, when sea ice receded, bears that had been out on the ice all winter would return to land. This was often the most dangerous time, when hungry bears and humans were concentrated in the same coastal areas. During spring, female bears with new cubs would emerge from their dens. These mother bears had spent months without eating, nursing their young with milk produced solely from their own fat reserves. They were hungry, determined to find food, and extremely protective of their cubs. The Inuit knew to be especially vigilant during this season, knew the specific behaviors that might indicate a mother bear separating from her cubs temporarily. To hunt, knew that accidentally coming between a mother and her young was one of the most dangerous situations possible. The stories told around the Qualik during long winter evenings weren't just entertainment. They were education. They were survival manuals disguised as tales. Stories of hunters who misread bear behavior and suffered the consequences. Stories of clever solutions to unexpected bear encounters. Stories of mutual respect between bears and humans. Children absorbed these lessons without realizing they were being taught, incorporated them into their understanding of the world they would need to navigate to survive. Some stories told of exceptional bears with unusual intelligence or behaviors. These weren't just tall tales. They were observations of animal individuality that Western science has only recently begun to acknowledge formally. The Inuit recognized that just as no two humans were exactly alike in their behaviors and tendencies, no two bears were exactly alike either. This understanding allowed for more nuanced responses to bear encounters, responses based on the specific situation rather than rigid rules. Physical fitness was another aspect of bear safety that was so integrated into daily life that it wouldn't have been seen as separate. The ability to move quickly through deep snow, to maintain balance on uneven ice, to throw with accuracy or thrust a spear with sufficient force. These weren't skills developed specifically for bear defense. They were part of everyday survival, necessary for hunting and traveling. But they served equally well when a bear appeared unexpectedly. Children's games often incorporated movements and skills that would later help them avoid or defend against bears. Games of hide and seek taught stealth and awareness of surroundings. Throwing games developed accuracy with spears and harpoons. Wrestling matches built strength that might someday be needed in a desperate situation. Play and survival preparation were not separate categories. The clothing designed for the Arctic environment provided some protection during bear encounters, but it also created challenges. The necessary bulkiness of winter garments could slow movement, could reduce dexterity when handling weapons. The Inuit designed their clothing with these considerations in mind, creating arm openings that allowed quick access to tools carried inside the warm layer, developing mittens with separate trigger fingers that could be exposed when needed for hunting or defense without removing the entire hand covering. Bear attacks did occur despite all precautions, despite all knowledge. When they did, the Response of the community was immediate and practical. Those with medical knowledge would treat wounds using available resources, sometimes seal fat mixed with particular mosses to prevent infection. Sometimes snow packed around injuries to reduce swelling and bleeding. Those with hunting skills would track the bear if it left the area, not primarily for revenge, but to determine if it was injured and potentially more dangerous in the future. The Inuit had no access to modern antibiotics or surgical techniques. A serious bear mauling was often fatal. If not from the immediate trauma, then from subsequent infection or the inability to contribute to survival tasks while healing. This reality made prevention even more essential, made the development of bear deterrence and avoidance strategies a matter of generational survival rather than just individual safety. If someone was killed by a bear, the community would mourn, but they would also learn. They would reconstruct what happened, would try to understand if there was a pattern of behavior they should be aware of, would adjust their own habits accordingly. Death was seen as part of the cycle of life in the harsh Arctic environment, but preventable death was something to be avoided through knowledge and preparation. The relationship between Inuit and polar bears wasn't static over time. As new tools became available through trade or innovation, as climate patterns shifted slightly, as traditions evolved, the specific strategies for coexistence adjusted. During periods when rifles became available, the balance of power shifted somewhat. But even then, the fundamental approach of respect and caution remained. A gun wasn't seen as making bears less dangerous, merely as providing another option in the range of possible responses. The settlement patterns themselves reflected bear awareness. While practical concerns like access to hunting grounds or shelter from storms were primary factors in choosing locations for seasonal or permanent camps, the presence of frequent bear activity in an area might lead to that location being avoided if equally good alternatives existed. The Inuit were pragmatic. They didn't seek unnecessary conflict with their powerful neighbors. The passing of knowledge about bear safety from one generation to the next wasn't left to chance. Young hunters wouldn't be sent out alone until they had demonstrated understanding of proper responses to potential bear encounters. They would accompany experienced hunters for years, would observe how these elders moved through the landscape, how they constantly scanned their surroundings, how they adjusted their routes based on fresh bear signs. This apprenticeship in safety was as important as learning how to build an igloo or repair a sled. For young women, the teaching was different but equally thorough. They learned to listen for approaching bears while focused on tasks like preparing, skins, or cooking. They learned to keep children close and quiet during dangerous seasons. They learned which tasks were safer to perform in groups and which could be done alone if necessary. The responsibility for safety was shared across genders and ages, each person playing their part in the community's survival. Some Inuit groups developed specific tools for bear warning. In areas where materials were available, they might construct wind chimes of sorts from bones or antlers that would sound when breezes blew, alerting them to check for approaching danger while they worked with heads down on intricate tasks like sewing or tool repair. These weren't decorative items. They were practical safety devices that served a specific purpose. The architecture of food storage evolved with bear safety in mind. While keeping food from spoiling in the challenging Arctic climate was the primary concern, preventing bears from accessing food caches was nearly as important. Stones might be piled in specific formations that would collapse noisily if disturbed, not preventing bear access but providing warning. Meat might be stored under heavy stones that a human could move with tools, but that would slow a bear long enough for people to respond. Platforms built on high poles kept food stores out of immediate reach, though particularly determined bears could sometimes still access them. The hunting of bears themselves, when it occurred, followed specific patterns designed to minimize risk. If possible, Bears would be hunted on the ice where hunters had more room to maneuver and could sometimes use the edge of ice floes as natural barriers. Hunting bears in their dens was generally avoided. It placed hunters at extreme disadvantage in confined spaces where the bear's strength was most dangerous. When bears were hunted, it was with community participation, multiple hunters working together to increase safety and success. The spiritual relationship with bears included specific rituals after a bear was killed. The skull might be placed facing east or pointed toward the sea, practices that varied between communities but that always acknowledged the bear as a being worthy of respect rather than merely a resource. Some communities would avoid speaking the polar bear's true name during certain activities, using descriptive terms instead out of a belief that bears could understand human speech and might be drawn to those who spoke of them directly. These spiritual practices weren't separate from practical survival. They reinforced behaviors that kept communities safe, created taboos around actions that might increase danger, encouraged attitudes of respect rather than carelessness. A hunter who believed bears had awareness similar to humans was less likely to take unnecessary risks or to waste parts of a killed bear, was more likely to maintain the balanced relationship that allowed both species to inhabit the same harsh landscape. The tools carried by Inuit when traveling reflected the possibility of bear encounters. A simple walking stick might be designed with a sharpened end that could serve as an emergency spear if needed. A knife used for preparing food or working on equipment would be kept accessible rather than packed away. Even items like snow goggles, carved pieces of bone or wood with narrow slits that prevented snow blindness, were sometimes designed to allow maximum peripheral vision for spotting approaching danger. Dogs, where they were part of Inuit communities, served multiple functions in bear safety. Beyond providing warning through their superior senses, they could sometimes distract or confuse a bear, giving humans precious time to prepare more effective defenses. Dogs were trained to bark and harass bears from multiple directions, making it difficult for the bear to focus on human targets. This partnership between species created a more effective defense than either humans or dogs could provide alone. The dogs weren't trained to attack bears directly. That would have been suicidal given the size and strength difference. Instead, they were taught to work as a team, to create confusion and noise without coming within striking distance of powerful paws. These weren't specialized bear dogs. They were the same animals that pulled sleds, helped with hunting, and lived as part of the community. Their bear defense roles were just one aspect of their integration into Inuit life. Particularly skilled hunters might develop specialized techniques for deterring problem bears that repeatedly approached settlements. Some accounts describe hunters using bolas, throwing weapons consisting of weights connected by cord to temporarily entangle a bear's legs. This wouldn't seriously injure the powerful animal but might discourage it from returning to the area. The goal was coexistence, not elimination. Bears were recognized as essential parts of the ecosystem, as fellow hunters whose presence indicated a healthy environment. Children were taught to recognize bear tracks from the time they could walk. They learned that a polar bear's tracks show 5 toes and claws, arranged in a pattern distinct from other Arctic animals. They learned that fresh tracks with clear edges meant a bear had passed very recently, that partially filled tracks might indicate a bear that had passed hours ago. They learned to judge the direction of travel, the size of the animal, sometimes even whether it was moving quickly or slowly. This knowledge becoming second nature, becoming as instinctive as recognizing human faces. The communities developed call systems, specific shouts or signals that communicated different levels of bear threat. A bear spotted at a distance might warrant one type of call, a bear approaching the settlement another, a bear actively threatening someone a third. These weren't formal signals like military commands. They evolved naturally within communities, but they were understood by all members and allowed for rapid, coordinated responses without confusion or delay. Some Inuit groups used decoys or diversions when traveling through areas known to have high bear activity. A piece of seal meat might be left at a distance from a planned campsite, giving any nearby bears something to investigate away from sleeping humans. This wasn't feeding bears in the modern sense of habituating them to human food. It was a temporary measure for a specific journey, a pragmatic use of available resources to increase safety during vulnerable periods like sleep. The design of sleds and other equipment took bear encounters into account. Essential survival tools would be secured but accessible, arranged so they could be quickly retrieved if needed. Less critical items might be positioned to be sacrificed if necessary, could be abandoned to distract a bear while humans retreated. Nothing was random in how possessions were organized during travel. Everything reflected an awareness of potential dangers and how best to respond to them. Weather awareness was another aspect of bear safety. The Inuit recognized that polar bears were more likely to be active during certain weather conditions, might be more desperate for food after particularly stormy periods when hunting would have been difficult. They adjusted their own activities accordingly, perhaps traveling in larger groups during these high-risk times, or remaining closer to settlements until conditions changed. They read the weather not just for how it would affect them directly, but for how it might influence bear behavior. The sounds of the Arctic environment were constantly monitored. The Inuit could distinguish between ice cracking naturally and ice bearing weight, between wind-moving snow and the sound of something large disturbing the surface. Their hearing was attuned to the specific sounds that might indicate danger, just as their vision was trained to spot the slight yellowish tint of a polar bear against the white landscape, or to notice the small black nose from remarkable distances. For special activities that required focused attention, like skinning, a seal, or repairing equipment, specific precautions might be taken. Someone might be designated as a lookout while others worked, or activities might be positioned so that most people naturally faced different directions, creating a circle of awareness that no single bear could approach undetected. These arrangements weren't discussed each time. They became habitual, part of the unconscious choreography of community life in bear country. The concept of personal space that exists in modern society had no real meaning in traditional Inuit settlements. People lived in close proximity out of necessity, for warmth, for efficient use of resources. But this closeness also provided safety. A bear was unlikely to encounter a single isolated human, would instead find groups working, eating, and sleeping together. This natural grouping served as a primary deterrent without requiring specific effort. When bears were particularly active near a settlement, the community might alter its routines. Children might be kept closer to dwellings. Hunting parties might become larger. Nighttime activities might be curtailed. These adjustments weren't made in panic. They were calm, practical responses to changing conditions. The flexibility to adapt to varying threat levels without major disruption was essential for communities that needed to accomplish vital tasks regardless of bear activity. Specific landforms were recognized as places where bears were more likely to den or to hunt. Pressure ridges in sea ice, where moving ice sheets collided to create jumbled formations, were known to attract seals to the patches of open water they created, which in turn attracted bears. Snowdrifts of certain shapes and positions were more likely to contain bear dens. This knowledge of landscape features as they related to bear behavior allowed the Inuit to predict likely encounter locations and adjust their movements accordingly. The sound of a bear attack. The specific quality of human screams combined with bear vocalizations was distinct and recognized instantly by all community members. Upon hearing such sounds, the response was immediate and coordinated. Those nearest would grab weapons and run toward the sound. Others would gather children and move them to safety. Still others would prepare to treat injuries. No orders needed to be given, no confusion about who should do what. The response was internalized through upbringing and community expectations. But attacks were rare compared to simple sightings or near encounters. Most interactions between Inuit and polar bears ended without physical contact or injury to either species. The bears would be encouraged to move away, or the humans would adjust their own movements to avoid conflict. This successful coexistence over thousands of years wasn't accidental. It was the result of accumulated knowledge, practical wisdom, and a worldview that saw humans as participants in nature rather than controllers of it. The hunting of seals, the primary food source for both Inuit and polar bears, was conducted with bear safety in mind. Hunters at breathing holes would position themselves to watch for bears as well as seals, would listen for the sound of approaching paws even, as they waited silently for a seal to surface. They would sometimes create small snow walls near their hunting positions, not substantial enough to truly protect against a determined bear, but sufficient to break up their outline and provide a few seconds of warning if a bear approached from behind. The butchering of seals or other game took place with bear safety as a consideration. Blood on snow or ice was a powerful attractant, could draw bears from considerable distances. When possible, hunters would process their catch quickly, would clean the kill site to minimize lingering scent, would dispose of unusable portions, away from settlements. These practices served practical hygiene purposes but also reduced the chance of attracting unwanted attention from hungry predators. Traveling across ice required constant attention to potential bear encounters. Unlike land, where tracks might be visible for days, sea ice was an ever-changing environment. A smooth surface could develop new cracks that bears might use to hunt seals. Areas of apparently solid ice might actually be thin enough for seals, and therefore bears, to maintain breathing holes. The Inuit developed an ability to read these conditions, to identify areas where bears were likely to be hunting and to adjust their routes accordingly. During the darkest winter months, when daylight was absent entirely in the far north, additional precautions became necessary. Hunters might carry small oil lamps that provided minimal light, just enough to help spot the reflective eyes of a bear in the darkness. They might travel with long poles that could be used to test the snow ahead of them for both thin ice and sleeping bears that might be concealed in drifts. The darkness wasn't feared. It was simply another condition to be managed through appropriate techniques. The relationship with bears extended to areas outside immediate safety concerns. The Inuit observed bear hunting techniques, learned from watching how bears would wait patiently at seal breathing holes or would stalk seals resting on ice. These observations influenced their own hunting methods, creating a knowledge exchange where both species, though sometimes in conflict, also learned from each other in a sense. This relationship, this mutual influence, it created a balance that allowed coexistence over millennia. When European explorers and whalers began entering the Arctic in increasing numbers, they often relied on Inuit knowledge to survive bear encounters. Many early written accounts of polar bear behavior come from these Europeans recording what their Inuit guides had taught them. The newcomers often noted with surprise how calmly the Inuit responded to bear sightings that terrified the Europeans, how they seemed to predict bear movements with uncanny accuracy, how they knew which bears were likely to be dangerous and which would probably avoid humans. This knowledge wasn't static or uniformly distributed among all Inuit groups. Different communities developed specific techniques based on their particular environments and experiences. Those living primarily along coastlines developed strategies focused on bears hunting seals, while those who spent more time inland had different approaches for the occasions when bears wandered away from their preferred marine hunting grounds. These regional variations created a rich diversity of bear safety practices across the Arctic. The integration of bear awareness into daily life was so complete that it became nearly invisible, became part of the underlying structure of existence rather than a separate category of behavior. Just as modern urban dwellers unconsciously scan for traffic before crossing streets, the Inuit automatically incorporated bear safety into every outdoor activity without conscious thought. It wasn't something they did. It was part of who they were as Arctic people. The changing of seasons brought different bear challenges that required different responses. During ice formation in fall, bears might be concentrated along coastlines waiting for sufficient ice to begin seal hunting. During spring breakup, they might be traveling with the retreating ice edge to maintain access to seals. The Inuit modified their own seasonal movements to accommodate these patterns, adjusting the timing or location of certain activities to reduce the likelihood of problematic encounters. Some evidence suggests that bears themselves learned to modify their behavior around Inuit settlements, creating a mutual adaptation. Bears that grew up in areas with human presence might learn to be more cautious, might develop preferences for remaining at greater distances than bears from areas with no human contact. This wasn't domestication or taming. The bears remained fully wild, but it represented a form of coevolution where both species adjusted to the presence of the other. The tools developed for Arctic survival often served multiple purposes, including bear protection. The snow knife used to cut blocks for igloo construction could become a defensive weapon if needed. The ice chisel used to create fishing holes could keep a curious bear at distance. This multi-purpose approach to tools reflected the pragmatic efficiency required in an environment where every extra pound carried represented additional energy expended, where resources for creating specialized tools were limited. If a community experienced an unusual number of bear encounters or aggressive bear behavior, they might relocate temporarily until conditions changed. This flexibility, this willingness to adjust to animal behavior rather than expecting animals to adjust to human preferences. It characterized the Inuit relationship with their environment. They understood that they were visitors in the bears' territory as much as the bears were visitors to human settlements, that coexistence required mutual accommodation. For all these precautions and adaptations, the Inuit maintained a deep respect for Nanook, the polar bear. They recognized its intelligence, its remarkable adaptation to one of Earth's most challenging environments, its role in maintaining the health of marine ecosystems. Bears were seen as worthy opponents when hunting was necessary, as dangerous but predictable neighbors the rest of the time. This respect manifested in how bears were discussed, how they were represented in art, how they were treated when killed. The practical knowledge of bears was inseparable from the spiritual understanding of them. In many Inuit spiritual traditions, bears were believed to be able to understand human speech, to remember how they were treated by specific individuals or communities, to intentionally choose whether to attack or avoid humans based on past interactions. These beliefs encouraged respectful behavior toward bears and careful handling of bear products after a hunt, creating practical benefits regardless of the literal truth of the spiritual claims. The intimate knowledge of bear behavior extended to understanding the subtle body language that might indicate a bear's intentions. A bear walking with head down might be following a scent trail and unaware of human presence. A bear standing on hind legs was likely trying to get a better view or smell, rather than preparing to charge. A bear swinging its head from side to side while approaching might be nervous or uncertain, potentially more dangerous than one approaching directly. These nuances couldn't be taught quickly. They were absorbed through years of observation and story. Bear encounters were inevitable in the shared landscape. So much of Inuit preparation focused on controlling where and when these encounters would occur. Necessary activities, like traveling to hunting grounds, couldn't be avoided, but they could be timed for periods when bears were likely to be hunting far out on the ice. Food processing that created strong scents couldn't be eliminated, but it could be done in locations that allowed good visibility and multiple escape routes. This control of context, this management of encounter conditions, It reduced the need for direct confrontation. Children's play incorporated bear awareness naturally. They might take turns pretending to be bears and hunters, learning through play how bears moved and how hunters responded. They would practice, staying silent when needed, moving quickly when required, working together against a common threat. Their games weren't designed as safety training, but they served that purpose nonetheless. Fun and survival preparation weren't separate categories in a world where vigilance was a constant requirement. The shared responsibility for safety meant that warnings about bear activity passed quickly through communities. If someone spotted bear tracks crossing a commonly used trail, if hunting dogs showed unusual alertness in a particular direction, if any sign indicated increased risk, this information would be communicated immediately to all community members. There was no concept of keeping such knowledge private or waiting for the right moment to share it. Safety information belonged to everyone. The most experienced hunters developed an almost supernatural ability to predict bear movements based on subtle environmental cues. They could look at how snow had drifted around a particular ice feature, could note the behavior of seabirds in an area, could feel the directional changes of wind patterns, and from these observations could make remarkably accurate predictions about where bears were likely to be hunting or traveling. This wasn't mystical knowledge. It was the culmination of lifelong observation and pattern recognition that went beyond what they could easily articulate to others. When hunting was necessary, when a bear had become too persistent around a settlement, or when food stores were dangerously low, the Inuit approached the task with a combination of practical skill and spiritual respect. Hunters might prepare themselves through specific rituals, might speak to the bear directly during the hunt explaining why its death was necessary, might offer thanks after a successful kill. These practices weren't superfluous to the practical task of hunting. They created a mental framework of focus and respect that improved safety and success rates. The specific techniques used to hunt bears reflected deep knowledge of bear anatomy and behavior. Hunters knew precisely where to place spears or arrows to reach vital organs, knew how to approach from directions that minimized the bear's sensory advantages, knew what times of day bears were more likely to be resting versus actively hunting. This knowledge, accumulated across generations and refined through direct experience, it made a dangerous necessity as safe as possible given the tools available. The changing seasons affected not just bear behavior, but the tools available for dealing with encounters. During winter, the hard-packed snow might allow for quick movement on snowshoes, providing an advantage in mobility that wasn't available during other seasons. During summer, when bare ground might be exposed in some areas, different strategies became necessary. The Inuit adjusted constantly to these changing conditions, developed seasonal variations in their bear safety practices that reflected the realities of their environment. The relationship between Inuit and bears wasn't static over centuries. It evolved as tools changed and as climate patterns shifted. During periods of climate warming, when sea ice formed later and broke up earlier, bears might spend more time on land, creating more potential for conflict. During colder periods, bears might remain on the ice hunting seals for longer stretches, reducing the frequency of encounters. The Inuit responded to these changes with characteristic adaptability, adjusting their practices to maintain the delicate balance of coexistence. In modern times, as guns became more common in Arctic communities, as permanent settlements replaced seasonal movements, as store-bought food supplemented traditional harvesting, the specific techniques of bear safety evolved, but the underlying philosophy remained remarkably consistent. Bears were still seen as intelligent beings deserving of respect, were still recognized as powerful neighbors rather than enemies to be eliminated, were still understood as essential parts of the Arctic ecosystem. Today, Inuit knowledge about polar bear behavior is increasingly recognized by wildlife biologists and conservation specialists. The observations made over thousands of years of coexistence are being incorporated into scientific understanding of these animals, are informing conservation efforts as climate change threatens traditional bear habitats. The practical wisdom developed for immediate survival has become valuable for the long term, survival of the species itself. If you were to find yourself in the traditional Arctic world of the Inuit, you would discover that bear safety wasn't something you thought about occasionally. It was something you lived continuously. Something that influenced how you designed your clothing and tools, how you built your dwelling, how you moved through the landscape, how you processed your food, how you raised your children, even how you thought about your place in the world. It was woven into the fabric of existence, not something separate or special. And somewhere out on the ice, polar bears went about their lives, hunting seals at breathing holes, teaching their cubs to stalk prey, occasionally encountering the strange two-legged creatures who shared their world. They too passed knowledge through generations, developed their own understanding of human behavior patterns, created their own strategies for coexistence. The relationship between species wasn't just humans adapting to bears, it was a mutual adjustment, a shared history spanning thousands of years in one of Earth's most challenging environments. In the end, survival for the Inuit wasn't about conquering nature or eliminating threats. It was about understanding deeply enough to coexist, about respecting the patterns and needs of all beings that shared their world, about finding a place within, the natural order rather than attempting to stand outside or above it. This fundamental approach, this way of seeing themselves as part of rather than separate from the world around them, it allowed them to live alongside Earth's largest land predator for thousands of years with a remarkable degree of success. The knowledge of how to detect, avoid, deter, and if necessary defend against polar bears. It wasn't written in books or taught in formal lessons. It lived in the practices of daily life, in the design of tools and clothing, in the stories told during long winter nights, in the games children played, in the very muscles and senses developed through a lifetime in bear country. It was practical and spiritual at once, pragmatic and deeply respectful. It recognized the bear as neither monster nor resource, but as fellow traveler in the Arctic landscape, sometimes competitor, sometimes threat, always neighbor. The walking patterns of the Inuit themselves evolved with bear awareness in mind. When traveling across open tundra or sea ice where visibility was good, they maintained a steady pace that allowed regular scanning of the horizon. When moving through areas with limited visibility, like pressure ridges in ice or rocky coastal zones, they would pause frequently, would listen, would check for fresh tracks before proceeding. These weren't conscious safety procedures. They were ingrained habits developed from earliest childhood. Travel routes were chosen with bear safety as one of many considerations. A path that provided good visibility in all directions might be preferred over a more direct route through terrain where bears could approach unseen. Certain areas known to attract bears during particular seasons might be avoided entirely if alternative routes existed. This knowledge of the landscape included understanding not just its physical features but its patterns of use by other species, particularly polar bears. The timing of daily activities reflected bear awareness as well. Certain tasks that required focused attention and reduced awareness of surroundings might be performed during daylight hours when bears could be spotted at greater distances. Activities requiring travel away from settlements might be scheduled for times when bears were known to be less active in that particular season. These adjustments weren't rigid rules. They were flexible adaptations that changed with conditions. The Inuit observed that bears, like humans, had individual personalities and behaviors. Some bears were naturally more cautious around human settlements, would circle at great distances and eventually move on without approaching closely. Others showed more curiosity or boldness, might approach structures or people directly. Recognizing these behavioral differences allowed for more effective responses, for adjusting deterrence tactics to the specific animal, rather than relying on one-size-fits-all approaches. Some bears became known to specific communities, were recognized by their movement patterns or physical characteristics. These weren't named pets. They remained fully wild, but they became familiar in the way that neighbors become familiar. Communities might know that a particular bear always approached from a certain direction, or hunted in a specific area during early winter, or showed unusual interest in certain types of food scraps. This knowledge of individual animals enhanced safety by making bear behavior more predictable. The Inuit recognized that a bear's behavior was influenced by its physical condition and life stage. A healthy, well-fed bear was generally less dangerous than a thin, hungry one. A young bear recently separated from its mother might be more unpredictable than an older, experienced animal. A male during breeding season might behave differently than at other times of year. These nuances of behavior based on condition and life stage. They were observed carefully and factored into responses during encounters. The physical environment itself often provided natural protection or warning systems. Wind patterns in certain areas would reliably carry human scent in particular directions, allowing bears to detect human presence and choose whether to approach or avoid. The sound of ice cracking under weight would travel long distances in the clear Arctic air, providing audio warning of large animals moving nearby. These natural features were incorporated into safety practices, became part of the environmental awareness that kept both species alive. Communities would sometimes deliberately create noise when bears were known to be in an area. Women might sing while gathering berries in areas with limited visibility. Hunters returning to settlements after dark might call out specific sounds that identified them as human rather than animal. These weren't attempts to completely avoid bear encounters, which would have been impossible in shared territory, but to ensure that encounters happened with awareness rather than by surprise. Surprise was dangerous for both species. The specific vocalizations used during potential bear encounters were carefully chosen. High-pitched yelling might be interpreted by bears as distress sounds similar to wounded prey, potentially attracting rather than deterring them. Instead, lower-pitched, steady sounds were often used, sounds that identified the source as human and potentially dangerous rather than as prey. These weren't fear responses. They were deliberate communications intended to establish boundaries. In areas where wood was available through driftwood collection or trade, Inuit might construct elevated platforms for observing the surrounding landscape. These wouldn't be tall enough to be truly safe from a determined bear. Polar bears are excellent climbers despite their size, but they provided better visibility and, earlier, warning of approaching animals. They served multiple purposes, allowing scanning for game animals and weather changes as well as safety monitoring. The handling of bears killed for food or protection followed specific practices, designed to show respect and maintain spiritual balance. The skull might be displayed in particular locations. The bones might be arranged in specific patterns. Portions of the meat might be shared according to traditional distributions that acknowledged both human needs and the bear's sacrifice. These weren't arbitrary cultural practices. They reinforced the relationship of mutual respect that allowed coexistence. Some Inuit groups traditionally offered a drink of water to a newly killed bear, a practice that acknowledged the bear as a person of sorts rather than merely an animal. Others would speak directly to the bear's spirit, explaining why the killing had been necessary and expressing gratitude for the resources the bear's body would provide. These expressions of respect weren't separate from practical survival. They were integral to the worldview that made survival possible. The Inuit understanding of bear behavior included recognition of how bears would test potential food sources or unfamiliar objects. A bear might approach something new in its environment with initial caution, might touch it lightly with a paw before committing further investigation, might circle it repeatedly before approaching directly. This pattern of investigation was predictable enough to be incorporated into safety practices, allowing humans to anticipate how bears would interact with new elements introduced to the environment. When processing a freshly killed seal or other game, hunters would remain particularly vigilant. The scent of blood and fresh meat could attract bears from considerable distances, could override the natural caution bears might otherwise show around humans. Specific precautions during these vulnerable times might include positioning lookouts, processing the catch quickly, or moving the processing to locations where approaching bears could be easily spotted. The concept of personal territory that exists for many carnivore species was well understood by the Inuit. They recognized that some bears established regular hunting, routes, or preferred areas, that these bears might defend these areas more aggressively than others. They observed how bears marked territory through scent and behavior, how they responded to other bears infringing on their preferred hunting grounds. This knowledge of territorial behavior informed human movements through the landscape, allowed for adjustments based on observed patterns. The limited technological tools available to traditional Inuit communities meant that successful coexistence with bears relied primarily on knowledge rather than equipment. A modern bear spray or firearm creates a sense of security that wasn't available to those using spears and knives. Instead, they developed an awareness so refined that modern observers have sometimes described it as a sixth sense, an ability to feel the presence of bears or to anticipate their movements in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those without the same lifetime of observation. This wasn't mystical awareness. It was the culmination of observational skills, developed over a lifetime in an environment where missing subtle signs could be fatal. It was knowing that particular birds circling in a certain pattern might indicate a bear had made a kill nearby, that a subtle change in how the wind carried scent might mean conditions had shifted to make human scent more detectable to bears, that a quality of silence different from normal ambient conditions might indicate wildlife had detected a predator and gone still. The Inuit recognized that survival required constant adaptation, that safety practices effective in one season or location might need adjustment in others. A strategy that worked well during daylight might be impractical during the long winter darkness. An approach that was successful on sea ice might be impossible on rocky shorelines. This flexibility, this willingness to adjust tactics based on conditions rather than insisting on fixed methods, it characterized the Inuit approach to all survival challenges, including bear encounters. The sharing of knowledge between communities created a network of bear awareness that extended across the vast Arctic region. Travelers between settlements would carry information about unusually high bear activity in certain areas, about individual problem bears that had been encountered, about new techniques that had proven effective for deterrence. This knowledge network allowed adaptation successful in one community to spread to others, created a collective wisdom greater than any individual or single settlement could develop. The sounds of the Arctic environment, the way wind moved across snow and ice, the creaking of sea ice under pressure, the calls of ravens and gulls, all became part of the background awareness that contributed to safety. An unusual silence where birds normally called might indicate a predator present. A pattern of sound that didn't match normal ice movement might indicate a large animal walking. This auditory awareness was as important as visual scanning, perhaps more so during the dark winter months or in conditions of limited visibility. Children were taught to interpret these environmental sounds from their earliest years. They learned to distinguish between the sound of snow falling from a slope due to wind and snow displaced by a moving animal. They learned to recognize the specific quality of ice cracking under the weight of something large versus natural thermal cracking. These weren't formal lessons. They were constant corrections and guidance from adults who reinforced accurate interpretation of sensory information. The Inuit approach to bear encounters was not to insist that bears change their behavior to accommodate human preferences, but to understand bear behavior deeply enough to adjust human activities accordingly. If bears were observed using a particular route to move between hunting areas, humans might simply choose to establish trails elsewhere rather than competing for the same travel corridor. This pragmatic approach recognized that attempting to change the ingrained behaviors of a powerful predator was less effective than adjusting more flexible human patterns. The communities recognized that complete avoidance of bears was neither possible nor desirable in the shared Arctic environment. Instead, they focused on managing interactions to reduce risk. They understood that most bears preferred to avoid direct confrontation with humans when given the option. That creating conditions where bears could detect human presence early and choose alternate routes was more effective than attempting to establish hard boundaries that bears were physically capable of crossing regardless of human preference. The use of dogs as warning systems and deterrents varied among Inuit groups, depending on local conditions and cultural practices. Where dogs were part of community life, they were often kept in positions where their superior senses could provide early warning of approaching bears. Their natural tendency to bark at unusual scents or movements became incorporated into the community's safety system. The relationship wasn't one of using dogs as weapons against bears, but of partnership where each species contributed its natural strengths to a shared goal. The Inuit developed techniques for determining the freshness of bear tracks that went beyond simple visual assessment. They might test the firmness of disturbed snow with a tool, might examine how wind-blown particles had accumulated in the depressions, might observe if any fresh precipitation had fallen into the tracks. From these observations, they could estimate with remarkable accuracy how recently a bear had passed, could make informed decisions about whether to proceed along a planned route or adjust their path. The processing and storage of harvest foods reflected bear awareness at every stage. Meat might be cut in specific ways that allowed it to be gathered quickly if a bear approached during processing. Storage caches might include decoy piles some distance from the main food store, giving bears an easier target that would satisfy their curiosity or hunger without threatening the community's essential winter supplies. These weren't random practices. They were deliberate strategies developed through generations of experience. The physical fitness required for Arctic survival served equally well for bear safety. The ability to move quickly through difficult terrain, to maintain full awareness during exhausting activities, to react with precision and coordination in moments of stress, these weren't separate skills developed specifically for bear encounters. They were the same capabilities needed for successful hunting, traveling, and shelter building. The physically demanding lifestyle created bodies and minds naturally prepared for the occasional crisis of a bear encounter. The Inuit understood that survival in the Arctic required community cooperation rather than individual heroics. During bear encounters, people would work together without need for discussion or planning, would create noise from multiple directions to confuse the animal, would move in coordinated patterns that allowed safe retreat while maintaining sufficient threat presence to discourage pursuit. These weren't trained responses in the modern sense. They emerged naturally from the deep social bonds and shared understanding of survival requirements. The specific tools varied by region and available materials, but all shared certain characteristics. They were multi-purpose, a walking staff that could become a spear, a knife used for preparing food that could serve as a defensive weapon. They were kept accessible rather than packed away when traveling. They were maintained carefully. A dull blade or weakened haft could mean death if needed in an emergency. These weren't specialized bear defense tools. They were the everyday implements of Arctic life, designed with multiple purposes in mind. The attitude toward bear encounters wasn't one of fear or dread, but of pragmatic acceptance. Bears were seen as neither evil nor good. They were simply powerful beings following their nature as hunters. This perspective allowed for clear thinking during encounters, reduced the panic that can lead to poor decisions in crisis moments. It fostered an approach based on understanding rather than emotion, on practical response rather than fear reaction. When European explorers first documented Inuit bear safety practices, they were often astonished by the calm, matter-of-fact way that potentially deadly encounters were handled. What seemed to the Europeans like remarkable courage or foolhardy risk-taking was simply the result of lifelong familiarity, of knowing with confidence what bear behaviors meant and how best to respond to them. This wasn't bravery in the face of the unknown. It was competence when dealing with the thoroughly known. The spiritual relationship with bears varied among different Inuit groups, but typically included some concept of bears as non-human persons rather than mere animals. They were seen as beings with awareness, with decision-making capacity, with their own social structures and purposes. This perspective fostered an approach to encounters based on communication and mutual accommodation, rather than simply domination or avoidance. It created a framework for coexistence that acknowledged the bear as a legitimate inhabitant of the shared landscape. Stories told to children weren't designed to frighten them about bears, to create terror of the wilderness. Instead, they presented bears as powerful neighbors to be respected and understood. Children learned that bears were neither monsters to be feared nor toys to be approached carelessly. They were fellow travelers in the Arctic landscape with their own needs and behaviors. This balanced perspective allowed children to develop appropriate caution without debilitating fear. The physical adaptations of polar bears themselves were well understood by the Inuit. They recognized how the bear's apparently white fur helped it approach seals undetected on ice, how its enormous paws distributed weight to prevent breaking through thin ice, how its acute sense of smell could detect seals or humans from extraordinary distances. This understanding of bear physiology and senses informed human behaviors, designed to work around these natural advantages when necessary. The bear's hunting techniques were observed carefully and incorporated into human understanding of potential encounter dynamics. The Inuit knew that a bear stalking a seal would approach very slowly, might remain motionless for long periods, might cover its black nose with a paw to remain hidden. They knew that a bear that had caught the scent of potential food would approach more directly, would move with purpose rather than caution. These behavioral differences signaled different levels of risk during human-bear encounters and called for different responses. During the limited Arctic summer, when plants briefly flourished in the continuous daylight, bears would sometimes supplement their primarily carnivorous diet with berries, grasses, and other vegetation. The Inuit observed these feeding patterns, noted which plants attracted bears during these seasons, and adjusted their own berry picking and plant gathering activities accordingly. They might visit berry patches in larger groups during these times, might make more noise than usual when gathering in areas where bears had been observed feeding on vegetation. The handling of bear products after a hunt followed specific practices designed to show respect and maintain proper relationships between humans and bears. The meat would be shared according to traditional distribution patterns that acknowledged both human needs and the spiritual significance of the bear. Tools made from bear parts, like needles from bone or amulets from claws, would be created with appropriate rituals or acknowledgments. These practices weren't separate from survival. They were part of the relational understanding that made survival possible. The Inuit concept of respect for bears didn't prevent them from hunting bears when necessary for food or protection. Rather, it created a framework for hunting that acknowledged the significance of taking such a powerful life. Hunters would approach the task with appropriate seriousness, would use methods designed to minimize suffering, would utilize as much of the animal as possible after a kill. The goal wasn't preservation in the modern conservation sense, it was relationship, was maintaining balance between human needs and respect for the bear's place in the natural and spiritual world. The practical knowledge of how to survive an actual bear attack existed alongside strategies for avoiding such situations. The Inuit understood that playing dead might work with some types of bear encounters but was dangerous in others. That fighting back was necessary if a bear began to treat a human as prey rather than as a threat. This nuanced understanding of appropriate responses based on the specific nature of an encounter reflected thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, wisdom passed down through direct teaching and stories. The clothing worn in the Arctic was designed primarily for protection against cold, but it served a secondary purpose in bear encounters. The thick layers, often including tough, durable outer garments made from seal or caribou skin, provided some protection against initial contact with teeth or claws. The design of hoods allowed for peripheral vision to be maintained, important for spotting approaching threats. Even the preference for natural materials and earth tones rather than bright colors may have served a protective function, making humans less visually distinctive against the landscape. The transition between seasons required specific adjustments to bear safety practices. During spring ice breakup, when bears might be forced to swim between remaining ice floes. The animals would be particularly hungry after winter fasting and potentially more dangerous if encountered on land. During fall ice formation, when bears were eager to return to sea ice hunting after summer food scarcity on land, they might pass through areas of human activity more frequently. These seasonal transition times called for heightened awareness and adjusted practices. The Inuit understood that female bears with cubs represented a particular danger, that a mother's protective instincts made her more likely to attack if she perceived a threat to her young. They would give family groups extra space when encountered, would avoid approaching from directions that might separate mother from cubs, would retreat particularly carefully and thoroughly from areas where bear families had been spotted. This wasn't fear. It was practical recognition of natural bear behavior and appropriate human response. The traditional Inuit naming of landmarks often incorporated information about bear activity. A peninsula might have a name that referenced its use as a regular bear crossing point. A valley might be known by a term that indicated it was frequently used for denning. A coastal area might be called by a name that warned of its attraction, or hungry bears during specific seasons. These weren't just place names. They were compressed information about environmental patterns that contained crucial safety knowledge. The design of temporary camps established during seasonal hunting, or traveling incorporated bear awareness. Sleeping areas might be arranged in a circle with feet toward the center, positioning sleepers to wake facing outward where they could immediately see approaching danger. Essential tools would be placed within arm's reach during sleep. Someone might be designated to remain awake as a lookout during particularly high-risk periods. These arrangements weren't random. They reflected practical responses to the realities of sharing territory with powerful predators. The Inuit developed specific practices for behavior if surprise encounters did occur despite precautions. They knew that running was likely to trigger chase instincts in bears, that slow, deliberate movements were less likely to provoke predatory responses. They understood that maintaining eye contact while backing away slowly communicated confidence rather than prey behavior. They knew that speaking in low, steady tones identified them clearly as human rather than prey animal. These weren't panic responses. They were practiced behaviors based on understanding bear psychology. The traditional hunting and traveling equipment of the Inuit was designed with multiple functions in mind, including potential use in bear encounters. A harpoon line used for seal hunting could become a trip line to slow an approaching bear if necessary. Snow knives used for igloo construction could serve as defensive weapons. Walking staffs could become spears with minimal modification. This multi-purpose approach reflected the practical reality of life in an environment where carrying specialized equipment for rare emergencies was an unaffordable luxury, given energy requirements and available materials. The creation of caches. For storing food and equipment during journeys incorporated bear awareness at every stage. Locations would be chosen that provided good visibility in all directions, that weren't on common bear travel routes, that allowed approach and retrieval without creating patterns bears might learn. The caches themselves would be constructed to slow bear access even if they couldn't prevent it entirely, would be positioned to be visible from a distance so hunters could assess if they had been disturbed before approaching closely. These weren't random precautions. They were systematic approaches to managing the realities of sharing territory. The Inuit recognized that bears, like humans, learned from experience and adjusted their behaviors accordingly. A bear that had successfully raided a poorly protected food cache might be more likely to investigate human structures in the future. A bear that had been effectively deterred from approaching a settlement might avoid similar situations in the future. This understanding of bear learning capacity informed how communities responded to bear encounters, created an approach that considered long-term patterns rather than just immediate safety. The sounds humans made while traveling were carefully modulated based on bear awareness. In areas with good visibility where seeing approaching bears was easy, normal conversation might continue. In areas with limited visibility or known bear activity, travelers might make deliberate noise to announce their presence, might call out at regular intervals or tap walking staffs against ice or rock. These weren't random behaviors. They were calculated to reduce the chance of surprise encounters which were the most dangerous for both species. The Inuit observed that bears, like humans, had distinct personalities and individual behavioral traits. Some bears were naturally more curious about human activities, would approach settlements or camps more frequently out of apparent interest rather than hunger. Others were more cautious, would remain at greater distances even when attracted by food smells. This recognition of bear individuality allowed for more nuanced responses to encounters, for adjusting deterrence strategies based on the specific animal rather than treating all bears as identical threats. The traditional knowledge of polar bear behavior has proven remarkably accurate when tested against modern scientific observation. Studies using GPS tracking and other technologies have confirmed patterns of movement and hunting behavior that Inuit hunters described generations ago. Observations about how bears select den sites, how they approach seals at breathing holes, how they respond to different ice conditions. All these traditional knowledge points have been validated by scientific research. This isn't coincidence. It's the result of thousands of years of careful observation by people whose lives depended on accuracy. The relationship between Inuit and polar bears continues to evolve in modern times. Climate change has altered sea ice patterns, has changed where and when bears can hunt effectively, has increased land-based encounters in some regions as bears spend more time off the ice. Modern technologies like snowmobiles, rifles, and satellite phones have changed the risk calculations around bear encounters. Yet many traditional practices remain relevant. The awareness of surroundings, the understanding of bear behavior, the community cooperation during potential danger. The core relationship of respect and pragmatic coexistence continues despite changing circumstances. Some Inuit communities today actively participate in scientific research on polar bears, sharing traditional knowledge with researchers while incorporating new information into their own understanding. This collaboration represents a recognition that both knowledge systems have value, that traditional ecological knowledge gained through generations of direct observation complements the systematic approach of modern science. The result is a more complete understanding of bear behavior and needs. Information crucial for conservation. Efforts in a rapidly changing Arctic environment. The traditional Inuit approach to bear safety wasn't about dominating or controlling bears, wasn't about establishing hard boundaries between human and bear territory. It was about understanding bear behavior deeply enough to adjust human activities accordingly. about recognizing that both species had legitimate needs and claims to the shared landscape. This fundamental perspective, this acknowledgement of bears as fellow inhabitants rather than as obstacles or enemies, it created the foundation for successful coexistence over thousands of years. The specific practices evolved over time as tools changed and as climate patterns shifted. During periods when sea ice was more extensive and stable, bears might remain offshore hunting seals for longer stretches, creating fewer interactions with humans. During warming periods when ice formed later and broke up earlier, bears might spend more time on land, increasing the frequency of potential encounters. The Inuit responded to these natural cycles with characteristic adaptability, adjusting their practices to maintain the delicate balance of coexistence as conditions changed. The transition to permanent settlements that occurred in many Inuit communities during the 20th century created new challenges in bear relations. Bears that might have encountered humans only occasionally when people moved seasonally now faced permanent human presence in specific locations. Communities that formerly dispersed during certain seasons now remained concentrated year-round. These changes required adaptations on both sides. New patterns of movement and awareness for humans. New responses to more consistent human presence for bears. Yet even as lifestyles changed, as technologies evolved, as permanent houses replaced seasonal dwellings, many traditional bear safety practices remained relevant. The awareness of surroundings, the recognition of bear behavior patterns, the community cooperation during potential danger, these continued to inform how Inuit communities approached coexistence with their powerful neighbors. Modern tools might supplement traditional knowledge, but they didn't replace the fundamental understanding developed over countless generations. If you were to find yourself suddenly transported to the traditional Arctic world of the Inuit, you would discover that bear awareness wasn't something taught in occasional safety classes or covered in emergency procedure manuals. It was part of learning to be human in the Arctic environment, was absorbed through observation and gentle correction from earliest childhood, was reinforced through stories and practical experience throughout life. It wasn't something you did. It was part of who you were. The depth of this knowledge, the integration of practical safety with spiritual understanding, the balance between respect and self-protection. These created a relationship between species that allowed both to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The Inuit didn't survive despite sharing their world with polar bears. In many ways, they survived because their relationship with bears and other wildlife forced the development of observational skills, community cooperation, and adaptability that served them in all aspects of Arctic life. And as you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine that distant world where ice stretches to the horizon, where the midnight sun or winter darkness shapes the rhythm of life, where the tracks of the great white bear might appear outside your door any morning. The Inuit lived in this world not with constant fear, but with constant awareness, with deep knowledge that allowed them to share the landscape with one of nature's most perfect predators. Their success wasn't measured by conquering or eliminating bears, but by creating a balanced relationship that acknowledged the needs and nature of both species. In this balance, in this mutual respect and adaptation, lies the true story of how the Inuit survived alongside polar bears for thousands of years. When we consider the Inuit relationship with polar bears, we often focus on the practical aspects of survival, the tools and techniques used to avoid or deter dangerous encounters. But equally important was the mental framework, the way the Inuit conceptualized their relationship with bears and other wildlife. They didn't see themselves as separate from or superior to the natural world. They understood themselves as participants in an interconnected system where all beings had their place and purpose. This perspective wasn't romantic or idealized. It was deeply practical. It created an approach to wildlife encounters based on understanding rather than fear, on respect rather than domination, on adaptation rather than expectation that other species would change their nature to accommodate human preferences. For the Inuit, surviving in bear country wasn't about conquering nature. It was about finding their proper place within it. The specific tools and techniques evolved over time, adapted to changing conditions and available materials. During periods when trade brought metal to Arctic communities, hunting implements incorporated these new materials while maintaining traditional designs that had proven effective. During times when climate patterns shifted, changing where and when bears hunted seals, human hunting and travel patterns adjusted accordingly. This flexibility, this willingness to incorporate new elements while maintaining core knowledge, it characterized the Inuit approach to all survival challenges, including bear safety. Modern scholars sometimes describe traditional knowledge as if it were static or unchanging, a set of fixed practices passed down without alteration through generations. But the Inuit understanding of bears and other aspects of their environment was dynamic, was constantly tested against real-world experience and adjusted when necessary. If a particular approach to deterring bears proved ineffective, if a pattern of bear behavior changed in response to environmental conditions, the community, knowledge evolved accordingly. The stories told about bears reflected this dynamic understanding. They weren't just entertaining tales or superstitions, they were compressed knowledge incorporating generations of observation and experience. When an elder described how a particular bear had behaved in a specific situation, they weren't just relating an interesting anecdote. They were providing valuable information about bear psychology that might save lives in future encounters. These stories, these oral records of experience, they formed the educational system that prepared each new generation for life in bear country. The Inuit relationship with polar bears wasn't strictly utilitarian, wasn't solely focused on avoiding danger or harvesting resources when hunting was necessary. There was an aesthetic appreciation as well, a recognition of the bear's beauty and perfect adaptation to the Arctic environment. Carvings and other art forms often depicted bears in positions of power and grace, acknowledged their strength and hunting skill without demonizing them as monsters or reducing them to mere resources. This balanced perspective extended to how bears were discussed, even after dangerous encounters. A bear that had threatened humans or damaged property wasn't described as evil or malicious. It was recognized as a being following its nature as a predator. The response might be practical. The bear might be hunted if it posed an ongoing threat to the community. But the action was taken without hatred or desire for revenge. This emotional equilibrium, this ability to respond to danger without being consumed by fear or anger, it was essential for clear thinking in crisis situations. The integration of practical safety with spiritual understanding created a relationship that transcended both categories. When an Inuit hunter showed respect for a slain bear through specific handling practices, when they spoke to the bear's spirit, explaining why the killing had been necessary, they weren't just performing empty rituals. They were reinforcing a worldview that recognized bears as intelligent, beings worthy of acknowledgement, were maintaining a relationship based on mutual respect rather than mere exploitation. This relationship extended beyond death. The proper handling of bear remains wasn't just about efficient use of resources, though that practical aspect was certainly important in the resource-limited Arctic environment. It was also about maintaining spiritual balance, about acknowledging the bear's sacrifice and ensuring that its spirit was properly honored. These practices weren't superstitious appendages to the practical business of survival. They were integral to the worldview that made survival possible. The deep time perspective of indigenous knowledge is often overlooked in modern discussions of wildlife management. The Inuit relationship with polar bears wasn't developed over years or decades. It emerged through millennia of shared existence. This time, depth allowed for the accumulation of knowledge about subtle patterns that might not be apparent in shorter observation periods. Created an understanding of cyclical changes in bear behavior related to multi-year or even multi-decade climate patterns. This long-term perspective is increasingly valued by modern conservation biologists and wildlife managers facing the challenge of rapidly changing Arctic conditions. Traditional knowledge about how bears responded to previous warm periods, about how they adjusted their denning locations or hunting strategies when ice conditions changed. This information provides valuable context for understanding current bear adaptations to climate-related habitat changes. The Inuit themselves have adapted to many changes over centuries, have incorporated new technologies, and adjusted to shifting environmental conditions while maintaining core cultural knowledge. This adaptability extends to their relationship with polar bears. Modern Inuit communities use snowmobiles instead of dog teams, use rifles rather than spears when hunting or protection is necessary, communicate via radio and satellite phone rather than through messengers between settlements. Yet many traditional bear safety practices remain relevant, have been incorporated into contemporary life rather than abandoned. The awareness of surroundings that characterized traditional bear safety practices has applications beyond immediately dangerous wildlife encounters. The habit of regularly scanning horizons, of noticing subtle environmental changes, of reading weather patterns and ice conditions. These skills contribute to general safety and success in the Arctic environment. The relationship with bears helped develop observational abilities that served many purposes in traditional Inuit life. The communal aspect of traditional bear safety reflects broader cultural values of cooperation and shared responsibility. When a bear approached a settlement, the response wasn't individualistic, wasn't every person for themselves. It was coordinated without need for formal leadership or assigned roles, emerged naturally from the understanding that survival required working together. This cooperative approach to danger characterized Inuit responses to all environmental challenges, not just bear encounters. The transmission of knowledge about bears from one generation to the next wasn't haphazard or left to chance. Children learned through direct observation of adult behavior, through gentle correction when they missed important signs or responded inappropriately to potential danger, through stories that made abstract concepts concrete and memorable. This educational process wasn't separated from daily life, wasn't restricted to formal teaching moments. It was continuous and contextual, was integrated into all aspects of growing up in the Arctic environment. For modern humans accustomed to living in environments largely controlled to eliminate danger, the Inuit approach to bear encounters might seem strange or unnecessarily risky. The willingness to share territory with predators capable of killing humans runs counter to contemporary expectations of absolute safety. Yet, for thousands of years, this approach proved sustainable, allowed both species to thrive in the shared Arctic landscape without the extermination campaigns that characterized wildlife management in many other regions. This coexistence wasn't perfect or idyllic. Bears occasionally killed humans despite all precautions. Humans killed bears when necessary for food or protection. But the relationship wasn't defined primarily by conflict, wasn't structured around an expectation that one species must dominate or eliminate the other to ensure its own survival. Instead, it was based on understanding and adaptation, on each species finding its place within the shared environment. The Inuit experience demonstrates that human safety doesn't necessarily require the elimination of predators from landscapes. It suggests that coexistence is possible through knowledge, respect, and appropriate precautions. That humans can live alongside potentially dangerous wildlife without either constant fear or reckless carelessness. This perspective has relevance beyond the Arctic, offers insights for wildlife management in many regions where human and predator territories overlap. The relationship between Inuit and polar bears has been shaped by the specific conditions of the Arctic environment, the extreme cold, the seasonal patterns of sea ice formation and breakup, the limited plant resources and resulting dependence on marine mammals for food. These factors created particular patterns of interaction between the species. Yet the underlying principles of knowledge, respect, and adaptation have broader application, can inform human-wildlife relationships in many contexts. As the Arctic changes due to warming temperatures and reduced sea ice, both polar bears and Inuit communities face unprecedented challenges. Traditional knowledge about bear behavior may need adjustment as the animals respond to habitat changes that have no precedent within human memory. Modern technologies and management approaches may play increasing roles in mediating the relationship between species. Yet the fundamental perspective of respectful coexistence, of seeking balance rather than dominance, remains relevant even as specific practices evolve. In many ways, the traditional Inuit relationship with polar bears offers a model for contemporary approaches to wildlife conservation and management. It demonstrates that human safety and predator preservation aren't inherently opposed goals, that both can be achieved through deep understanding of animal behavior and appropriate human adaptations. As modern societies grapple with questions of how to maintain biodiversity while ensuring human well-being, the Inuit experience provides valuable insights. The traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior wasn't written in books or preserved in formal educational institutions. It lived in practices, in stories, in the design of tools and clothing, in the arrangement of communities and travel routes. It was embodied knowledge, was carried in muscles and reflexes trained through years of moving through bear country, was embedded in sensory awareness developed through constant attention to environmental signals. This knowledge wasn't abstract or theoretical, it was lived and practical. The preservation of this knowledge in contemporary contexts presents challenges. As lifestyles change, as young people spend more time in formal education and less time directly observing and participating in traditional activities, some aspects of traditional bear knowledge may be at risk of fading. Many Inuit communities are working actively to document and transmit this knowledge, are creating programs that combine traditional practices with modern educational approaches to ensure that core survival skills and perspectives aren't lost. These efforts recognize that traditional knowledge about bears and other aspects of Arctic life isn't merely of historical or cultural interest. It remains practically valuable for contemporary survival and well-being. The ability to read ice conditions, to predict weather patterns, to recognize signs of bear presence. These skills continue to save lives in an environment where conditions can change rapidly and where help may be distant. The knowledge developed over thousands of years retains its relevance even as contexts shift. The Inuit experience with polar bears reminds us that human safety in potentially dangerous environments doesn't depend primarily on eliminating threats or creating impermeable barriers between humans and wildlife. It depends on knowledge, on awareness, on appropriate behavior and preparedness. It suggests that the modern tendency to expect environments entirely free from danger may be neither realistic nor necessary, that humans can learn to assess and manage risk rather than expecting its complete absence. This perspective has particular relevance as climate change alters traditional patterns of human-wildlife interaction in many regions. As animal ranges shift in response to changing temperatures and precipitation patterns, as extreme weather events displace both humans and wildlife from traditional territories, new configurations of shared habitat emerge. The indigenous approach of knowledge-based coexistence offers valuable guidance for managing these novel situations. The traditional Inuit relationship with polar bears wasn't without conflict or danger. Bears occasionally killed humans despite all precautions. Humans killed bears when necessary for food or protection. But these incidents weren't seen as evidence that coexistence was impossible or undesirable. weren't used as justification for campaigns to eliminate bears from areas of human activity. They were recognized as the inevitable occasional outcomes of sharing territory with powerful predators, were responded to with practical measures rather than fear-based overreaction. This balanced perspective stood in stark contrast to approaches adopted in many other regions, where predators were systematically eliminated from landscapes to create environments perceived as safer for human habitation and livestock. The Inuit demonstrated that another path was possible, that knowledge and respect could create conditions where both humans and predators thrived in shared territory. This lesson has renewed relevance as many regions now work to restore predator populations after earlier extermination campaigns. The relationship between Inuit and polar bears wasn't static over centuries. It responded to changing conditions and incorporated new technologies when available. During periods when trade networks brought metal tools to Arctic communities, hunting and defense implements evolved, incorporated these new materials while maintaining designs refined through generations of use. During times when climate patterns shifted, changing where and when bears denned or hunted, human activities adjusted accordingly. This dynamic quality characterized all aspects of Inuit life, reflected a worldview that valued practical adaptation over rigid adherence to tradition for its own sake. Practices that no longer served their purpose in changing conditions were modified or abandoned. Innovations that offered genuine improvements were incorporated without resistance. This flexibility, this willingness to evolve while maintaining core knowledge and values, it allowed Inuit culture to survive and thrive through countless changes. And as you drift further towards sleep, imagine yourself in that world of ice and sky, where human ingenuity and animal intelligence created a delicate balance that endured for thousands of years. The bears moved across the landscape following ancient patterns, hunting seals at breathing holes, creating dens and snowdrifts where females would birth and nurse cubs. The humans moved through the same landscape with full awareness of their powerful neighbors, with knowledge passed down through countless generations, with respect for the bear's place in the natural order. This wasn't a relationship without tension or occasional conflict, wasn't a romanticized harmony that ignored the realities of survival in a harsh environment. It was a practical coexistence, based on deep understanding, on recognition that both species had legitimate claims to the shared territory, on adjustments that allowed each to pursue its needs while minimizing dangerous direct confrontation. In this balance, in this mutual accommodation rather than domination, lies a wisdom about human-wildlife relationships that retains its value in our rapidly changing world. And now, as sleep approaches, let the rhythm of snow falling on ice, the distant sounds of wind moving across vast open spaces, the imagined tracks of the great white bear stretching toward the horizon, let these images carry you into peaceful rest. The knowledge of how the Inuit survived alongside polar bears for thousands of years. It reminds us of human adaptability and resilience, of our capacity to find our place within the natural world rather than standing apart from it. In that ancient wisdom, in that relationship of respect and practical coexistence, there may be lessons for our own challenging times of environmental change and uncertain futures.